Have you ever stopped and really looked at them? Not just passed by them, not just accepted them for what you were told they are, but actually looked. Those massive bells, hanging in towers, placed on rooftops, built into structures that already don't make sense, and asked yourself one simple question: what were they really for? Because the explanation we're given doesn't match what we see. We're told they were used for timekeeping, for ceremonies, for signaling. But when you look at their size, their placement, their design, that explanation starts to feel incomplete. Because these weren't small bells, they weren't decorative, they were massive, engineered, positioned at the highest points of structures that already look like they were built for something more. And once you start noticing them, you see them everywhere. Old world buildings, cathedrals, towers that stretch higher than they need to. And that's when the question changes. Not what are they, but what were they doing? Long before they were seen as decoration, before they were explained away as simple instruments, these bells were being uncovered. Early archaeological digs, going back to the 18th century, began revealing structures that didn't quite match the narrative people expected. Layers of earth were being cleared, old foundations exposed, entire sections of cities buried beneath what was considered modern at the time started to come back into view. And within those structures, they kept finding the same thing: bells. Not small ones, not ceremonial pieces you could carry or move easily. Massive, fixed installations, embedded into towers, mounted into frameworks that looked like they were built around them, not the other way around. In some cases, these bells were found still suspended in their original positions, high above ground level, connected to structural systems that extended downward into the building itself. And what stood out to the people documenting these discoveries wasn't just the size, it was the condition. Many of these bells weren't cracked, they weren't deteriorated beyond use. They were intact, as if whatever system they were part of had simply stopped. And then there was the material. These weren't crude metal casts, they were refined, smooth, often composed of alloys that even at the time weren't easily explained in terms of local production methods. Some reports describe unusual tonal qualities when they were struck, deep, sustained, almost unnaturally stable in their resonance, not the kind of sound you'd expect from something made purely for signaling or ceremony. And then there was the placement. These bells weren't found randomly scattered, they were consistently located at elevated points, towers, spired rooftops, high structural platforms that had clear line of sight across entire areas. And that consistency mattered, because when the same type of object is found in the same type of position across multiple locations, it stops looking decorative. It starts looking functional. Even more interesting were the surrounding structures. In several excavation accounts, the towers housing these bells weren't isolated. They were connected to larger architectural systems, domed buildings, metal frameworks, underground extensions that hadn't been fully mapped or understood. Which raises a question that wasn't answered at the time and still isn't fully addressed now. Why would something as large and precisely made as these bells be placed at the highest points of structures over and over again, across completely different regions. If they were just meant to be heard, they wouldn't need that level of consistency. They wouldn't need that kind of structural integration. But if they were interacting with something, if height changed their function, if position affected what they did, then everything about their design starts to make sense. Because at that point, they're not just bells, they're components. And once you see them that way, it becomes clear they were never meant to stand alone. Once you stop thinking of sound as something passive, everything changes. Because sound isn't just something you hear, it's force. It moves through matter, it carries energy, it creates pressure, vibration, and resonance that can interact with physical objects in very real ways. This isn't theoretical, it's measurable. Frequency can crack glass, disrupt structure, shift materials, and when controlled correctly, it doesn't just make noise, it produces power. Now scale that up. Take that same principle and apply it to massive engineered systems. Bells large enough to produce deep sustained frequencies, positioned high above cities, built into structures designed to amplify and direct vibration. At that point, those bells stop being symbolic. They become generators. And once you understand that, you start to recognize something else that shows up throughout history. Devices that weren't called power systems, but behaved exactly like them. War trumpets, also referred to in some accounts as air amplifiers or tube horns. Massive horn-like structures, metallic, extended, designed not just to produce sound, but to project it. Focused, directed, amplified. These weren't small instruments. They were large-scale acoustic devices, often mounted or positioned in ways that allowed them to carry sound across vast distances. And they show up repeatedly in historical imagery from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. Military settings, field operations, urban environments during periods of conflict. At first glance, they're described as signaling tools, communication devices. But when you look closer, that explanation doesn't fully hold. Because their design isn't optimized for simple signaling. It's optimized for projection, for pushing sound outward with force, for creating pressure waves that travel. And that's where things get more specific. There are documented instances of similar acoustic devices being used during World War II, particularly in Russia, where large horn-based systems were deployed in attempts to disrupt incoming aircraft. Not through physical impact, but through sound, through frequency. The idea was simple. If you could generate enough acoustic force, enough resonance in the air itself, you could interfere with stability, with movement, with the ability of something to maintain control in flight. Even if those later attempts weren't perfected, they point to something important. The understanding was there. Sound could be weaponized. Sound could be directed. Sound could be used as force. And once you see that, those earlier devices stop looking primitive. They start looking like remnants, simplified versions of something that already existed at a much higher level. Because when you compare those war trumpets, those tube horns, to the massive bells integrated into Tartarian structures, the connection becomes clear. Same principle. Resonance, amplification, projection. But on completely different scales. Those horns were directional, focused bursts. But the bells were something else entirely. They weren't just projecting sound, they were sustaining it, creating continuous frequency fields. And when those frequencies interacted with the environment, with structures, with the ground beneath, they didn't just produce noise, they produced usable energy, which means those bells weren't just part of architecture. They were part of a system that understood something we've only scratched the surface of. That sound, when controlled, is power. And once you realize that, everything else starts to make a lot more sense. Once you understand that sound can be used as force and not just as noise, everything starts connecting in a way that's hard to ignore. Because the bells weren't isolated, and the horns weren't isolated either. They show up in the same environments, the same time periods, the same types of structures. And when you step back and look at it all together, it stops looking like coincidence. It starts looking like a system. Think about it. You have massive bells positioned at the highest points of Tartarian structures, designed to generate deep, sustained frequencies. Then you have horn-like devices, war trumpets, tube horns, air amplifiers, designed to take sound and project it outward, focused, directed. One generates, one directs. That's not random. That's a process. And once you recognize that process, you start seeing how everything else fits into place. Because those bells weren't just sitting above empty buildings. They were mounted onto structures that already stand out. Domes, spired towers, metal frameworks that look less like decoration and more like components. Almost like receivers, amplifiers, conductive surfaces designed to interact with vibration. And beneath many of these structures, there are reports of underground chambers, tunnels, sub-levels that extend far deeper than what's accessible today. So now the layout becomes clearer. At the top, the bell, generating frequency. Across the structure, the architecture, amplifying, shaping, stabilizing that frequency. And extending outward, the horns, projecting it, directing it, focusing it where it needs to go. Then below, the underground systems, distributing, grounding, or even storing that energy. That's not just architecture, that's a network, a full system built around sound. And what makes it even more convincing is how consistent this layout is. You can find variations of it across different cities, different countries, different regions that had no direct communication with each other at the time. Yet the same elements keep appearing. Elevated bells, structured towers, directional horn-like devices, subterranean extensions. It's the repetition that matters, because repetition means intention, and intention means design. Now think about how modern systems are built. Power generation, distribution, transmission. It's always layered, always interconnected. What you're seeing here follows that same logic, just using a completely different medium. Frequency instead of electricity, resonance instead of fuel. And that's where the horns become even more important. Because without them, you don't have direction. The bells create the energy, but the horns control where it goes. They focus it, concentrate it, turn it from something ambient into something targeted, which explains why those same horn-like devices later show up in military use. Because even in their reduced form, even without the full Tartarian system behind them, they still retained part of their function. Projection, force, a fragment of what they were originally part of. And when you place them back into their original context, alongside the bells, alongside the architecture, alongside the underground systems, they stop looking like separate inventions. They look like broken pieces of something that used to operate as one. A network that didn't rely on wires, didn't rely on combustion, didn't rely on anything we consider standard today. Just frequency, generated above, directed outward, distributed below. And once you see it laid out like that, it becomes very hard to believe these structures were ever meant to be just buildings, because everything about them suggests they were active, functional, alive in a way that modern structures simply aren't. And whatever that network was capable of, it was far more advanced than the fragments we're left with now. At a certain point, it stops being about buildings, because once you see how the bells function,
once you understand what the horns were capable of, once the idea of frequency as power actually settles in, you realize the system doesn't end at the ground. It extends beyond it. The next question becomes unavoidable. What else could that kind of system do? Because if sound, if frequency, can be controlled at that level, then its applications wouldn't stop at powering structures. It would extend outward, into movement, into transport, into the air itself. There are fragments, images, sketches, descriptions that suggest something existed alongside these systems. Not just advanced buildings, but advanced craft. Flying machines that don't behave the way we're used to seeing. No visible propulsion, no exhaust, no heavy mechanical components forcing them forward. Instead, they appear stable, balanced in the air in a way that feels unnatural by modern standards, almost like they aren't fighting gravity, but interacting with it. And that's where frequency comes back in. Because if the bells were generating large-scale resonance and the horns were capable of directing and focusing that resonance, then the environment itself wasn't static. The air wasn't just something you moved through. It was something that could be influenced, adjusted, shaped. And if you can shape the medium something moves through, you don't need to push against it the same way. You can move with it. There are older accounts, often overlooked, that describe craft moving smoothly across the sky. Not loud, not aggressive, silent, gliding in a way that doesn't match combustion-based flight. And when people tried to describe it, they didn't have the language for it. So they called them airships, flying machines. But those descriptions don't capture what was really happening. Because these weren't just machines moving through air. They were likely interacting with a field of frequency that already existed around them. A field generated by the same system built into the cities below, which changes everything. Because now you're not looking at isolated technology, you're looking at integration. The ground system and the aerial system working together, the bells creating a base frequency, the structures stabilizing it, the horns directing it upward and outward, and the craft responding to it, using it, almost like a ship moving through water that's already in motion. And this would explain something else that doesn't get talked about enough. Why so many of these structures were built with vertical emphasis. Height, elevation, spired towers reaching into the sky. Because if the system extended upward, if the frequency field wasn't limited to the ground, then those structures weren't just architectural choices. They were part of a vertical network, linking the ground to the air. And the horns again become critical here. Because while the bells generate and sustain, the horns focus. They could direct frequency upward, concentrate it into pathways, creating channels, not visible, but functional. Guided routes through the air where movement becomes easier, more stable, more controlled. And if that's the case, then those flying craft weren't operating randomly. They were moving within a system that was already established, which makes them far more advanced than anything we use today. Because modern flight relies on force, fuel, thrust, resistance. This system would rely on alignment, resonance, harmony with the environment itself. And that's why it feels so foreign when you look at those old depictions, because it doesn't match what we've been taught is possible. But when you place it back into the context of Tartarian technology, of bells, horns, and frequency-based systems, it doesn't feel impossible anymore. It feels consistent, like a natural extension of a world that understood something we no longer use. And if that world really operated this way, then flight wasn't an isolated breakthrough. It was just another function of a system that was already in place. At a certain point, it becomes less about discovery and more about motive. Because systems like this don't just disappear on their own, they get replaced. And when they get replaced, it's usually because something new benefits from their absence. By the late 1800s into the early 1900s, a different kind of system was being established. Industrial, centralized, built around resources that could be controlled. Oil, coal, electric grids that required infrastructure, ownership, limitation. And once that system begins to take hold, anything that operates outside of it becomes a problem. Because a frequency-based system, one built on resonance, on sound, on structures already integrated into cities, doesn't require fuel in the same way. It doesn't rely on extraction. It doesn't create dependency. And that changes everything. Because if people have access to energy that isn't controlled, then the structure built on controlling energy starts to break down. And that's where the shift becomes intentional. Because once oil and industrial power became dominant, this older system didn't just become obsolete. It became a threat, not because it was inefficient, but because it was too efficient, too accessible, too independent. And when something gives that level of freedom, it doesn't get adopted. It gets removed. That's why you start seeing something very specific in historical imagery from that period. Mass collections of bells, not one or two being relocated, but entire stockpiles, rows of them, stacked, removed from towers, taken out of structures where they once sat permanently. And the explanation given is always simple. Recasting, reusing metal, repurposing materials for industrial needs. But that doesn't fully explain the scale, because these weren't random objects being melted down. They were systematically gathered, taken from places where they had been part of something larger, and once they were removed, those systems stopped functioning. The bells weren't decorative, they were critical, and once they were gone, whatever network they were part of went silent. At the same time, the narrative begins to shift. These structures are redefined. Bells become ceremonial, architectural elements become aesthetic. Function is replaced with explanation. And what used to be seen as part of a system is now presented as history without purpose. But when you look at it closely, the timing lines up too well. The rise of controlled energy, the removal of independent systems, the collection and disappearance of key components. It doesn't feel accidental. It feels coordinated. Because once that old system is gone, there's nothing left to compete with what replaces it. And from that point forward, the world runs on something entirely different. Once the system was dismantled, the next step wasn't just removal, it was erasure. Because removing the technology isn't enough. You have to remove the understanding of it. And that's where the events of the 1800s into the early 1900s start to take on a different meaning. Conflicts, invasions, expansion across continents, not isolated, but widespread. Regions across the world undergoing rapid change. Territories being taken, cities being rebuilt, entire populations being absorbed or erased. And within that period, what remained of the old world, what remained of Tartaria, would have still existed in fragments. Isolated colonies, remnants of a system that hadn't fully disappeared yet. And if those remnants still had access to frequency-based technology, to bells, to resonant systems, to structures still functioning, then they wouldn't just be historical, they would be obstacles. And when you look at the scale of destruction during that time, it raises questions, because the weapons we're told were used don't fully match the damage that's recorded. Entire buildings showing signs of melting, stone warped in ways that don't align with standard fire, metal distorted beyond what conventional heat sources of that time should produce. Even events like the American Civil War leave behind accounts and imagery that don't always align cleanly with the technology we're told was available. Cannons, gunpowder, basic artillery. Yet the damage in some cases looks far more intense, as if something else was involved, something capable of producing extreme energy, focused,
directed. And when you connect that back to frequency, to resonance, to systems built around sound and vibration, it starts to suggest that the same technology wasn't just used to power cities. It was used to dismantle what remained, to wipe out the last functioning parts of that old world system, not randomly, but deliberately. Because once those remaining colonies were gone, once the last operational pieces were taken offline, there was nothing left to reference, nothing left to rebuild from. And that's when the final step happens. History is rewritten. The old world is reduced to fragments, to theories, to things that never fully existed. And the technology tied to it is either repurposed in limited ways or buried completely, harvested, studied, kept out of reach. And from that point forward, what we know as modern history begins. But it's built on top of something else, something that was already there. And this is where everything comes back to the bells. Because out of everything that was removed, everything that was buried, everything that was rewritten, the bells are still here. Not all of them, not in their original form, but enough remain to remind you that something used to be different. You can still find them, mounted in towers, hanging in structures that no longer use them the way they were intended. Silent, presented as historical artifacts, ceremonial objects, something to look at, but not something to question. And in many cases, access to them is limited. Restricted areas, controlled environments. Some are removed entirely, placed in storage, in collections that aren't publicly accessible. Others remain in place, but disconnected, no longer part of any system, no longer active. And that's the part that stands out the most. Because if they were truly just decorative, there would be no reason to control them, no reason to remove them in mass, no reason to redefine their purpose so completely. But they were, which suggests that what they were originally used for still matters, even now. Because once you understand what they could do, once you connect them to the structures, to the horns, to the systems that once operated around them, it becomes clear. They weren't just bells. They were key components in something much larger. A network built on frequency, on resonance, on a form of energy that didn't rely on what we use today. And whatever that system was capable of, whatever it allowed, it was powerful enough to be removed, powerful enough to be replaced, and important enough that even now, what remains of it is kept quiet, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to look at it and ask the same question that started all of this.